immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. You may be seated. So this whole scene takes place with just two characters. And the first character, the Galilean man, this is truly a Jew, right? Jesus born in Bethlehem of Judea and raised, of course, in Nazareth of Galilee. Jesus, a son of David and therefore a son of Abraham. Truly a Jew, this Galilean man. But look at what Mark tells us about his objective. It may be surprising at this point in Mark's gospel to read that he goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon. If you know anything about the geography and the cultures involved here, that's a surprising statement. He left and went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. And we can see that he's not going to these Gentile areas in order to begin a ministry to the Gentiles. That's not his objective, right? You can tell, of course, by what he says to the Gentile woman, which we'll see more of in a minute, but also you can tell by how Mark sets this up. Look there at how he begins this. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. Didn't want anyone to know? This is not a public ministry beginning now to the Gentiles. What's his objective then, if that wasn't it? Well, you can infer a couple. First, we can assume that one of his objectives was to escape from the Jewish religious leaders, especially after the encounter he just had with them and the condemnation he just heaped on them. And we can infer from their earlier actions that they're going to be trying all the more at this point to put him to death. And so, knowing that his time had not yet come, not out of fear, but out of prudence and meeting the objective of his ministry, he leaves the region where he's been ministering, where we've been seeing him ministering in Mark's gospel, in Galilee, and he leaves and goes to Gentile areas, to Tyre and Sidon. And of course, the second objective in his departure is that he might be able to teach his disciples privately. I say that because not only does Mark tell us that Jesus intends to remain hidden, he's not going to have a public ministry, but you can also tell in the rest of his time in the Gentile regions, which we'll see him there for a while now, there won't be any public teaching. Now, that's kind of remarkable given what his ministry has looked like to date. That's been his primary objective since the first chapter of Mark's gospel, right? Is teaching and then supporting his teaching with miracles, but he's not doing that in these regions. But of course, even though he wanted to remain hidden, he wanted to remain out of view so that he could privately teach his disciples, his reputation is too great. He's too famous at this point. The word about him has reached even here, and so Mark says, yet he could not be hidden, or literally he couldn't escape notice. There was no way for the people not to know, and so this woman hears, and she comes. And she comes with a pressing need, which we'll see more about later, and she comes begging for his help. But notice, besides his objective, look at his obstinance. This is remarkable as well, isn't it? Because we've seen this man, Jesus, in his teaching and then in the doing of miracles. He has been unfailingly generous and compassionate and gracious toward the needs of people. We've never seen anything like the kind of response that he gives here in verse 27 when he says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now remember, when you read those words, this is a different time, a different place, an entirely different culture than ours. When you hear take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, maybe a 21st century American would say, "Aw, a puppy. I like puppies." In this culture, we have what I think has surpassed a healthy appreciation and probably an almost unhealthy appreciation of dogs. In fact, many people prefer them to children, which is alarming. But at this time and in this place, when Jesus is ministering, the word dog was no compliment. Dogs were, of course, to the Jewish people, unclean animals, according to the law of Moses. And the word dog came to be used for Gentile people by the Jews in a dismissive and insulting way. You've heard Paul, in fact, use that kind of language. He spoke of false teachers in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 2, where he warned the Philippians, "Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh." When he warned them to look out for the dogs, he's not talking about animals. He's talking about the false teachers. And that's the kind of language that Jesus uses here. So, is Jesus being rude to this poor woman? Is he being judgmental and dismissive like the Jews were wont to do towards Gentiles? Well, let me soften his statement a little bit, because there is a sort of the typical word for dog, and you would use that word to refer to usually the feral dogs who were roaming the streets of cities at this time, usually in packs, and they're eating garbage and dead animals, and so they're a threat to cleanliness, but they're also a threat even to your life. You don't want to be caught by a pack of dogs. Now that's the word that Paul uses, the normal word. There's another word, and it's the same word just in the diminutive, and that word was used of domesticated dogs. Yes, they did have domesticated dogs, and they did keep them in houses. Jews wouldn't, but the Gentiles certainly would. Now, they didn't have quite the estimation of them that we do. They weren't their fur babies. But those dogs at least weren't a threat, and they were seen as having value. And Jesus uses that latter word, referring to domesticated animals, to pets. He doesn't refer to her as a feral, vicious, unclean beast roaming the streets, but as a domesticated pet. But he still called her a dog. It's still harsh. It's still offensive. It wouldn't be at all surprising to hear a Jew use that kind of language toward a Gentile, but it is shocking to hear Jesus say it, to hear Jesus speak this way towards this woman. Now, he does grant her request, as you saw in the text, but effectively what he does here first is he sets up an obstacle on purpose. And we'll see more on what he's doing and why he's doing that in a minute. But in noting that he granted her request, I don't want to miss how he does it, because this is quite a display of his omnipotence. This is not the first time, of course, that we've seen the Lord Jesus cast out a demon. And in previous cases of demonic possessions, people having demon or being demonized, we've seen Jesus confront those unclean spirits directly, right? He addresses them. Now, he doesn't use the incantations, the magic formulas that the Jews and other ancient peoples of the day used, but he did speak to them and command them and give them instructions. In fact, in one case, with the man who had the legion of demons, we even saw him ask the demon's name and have that level of interaction. But apparently, he hasn't needed to do any of that at any point, because in verse 29, he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." He doesn't go to her. He doesn't go with the woman to the daughter and confront the demon directly. He doesn't speak any magic spells. And in fact, he doesn't speak any words to the demon at all. He apparently just wills it. And so in verse 30, she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Now, the girl didn't do it. This child was powerless over this unclean spirit. Mark simply records that she had an unclean spirit, but Matthew gives us a little more detail. In Matthew's account of this event, he says in chapter 15, verse 22, "And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.'" Severely oppressed. Surely this little girl wants that demon gone more than anything in the world, but of course she's utterly powerful to effect her release. Now, do you think the mother wanted the demon gone? What would a mother do to deliver her daughter from this kind of oppression? What wouldn't a mother do to deliver her daughter from this? She would do anything in her power, but she doesn't have power over this. Do you think if she was able to find anyone in the region who had the power to deliver her little girl from this oppression, do you think she would seek help? Of course she would have, but there isn't anyone. Nobody could deliver this little girl, but Jesus could, and Jesus did. And he did what no one else could do without going anywhere, without saying anything, just a silent command, apparently, and instant deliverance. Now, demons, of course, are much more powerful than we are. And on our own, like this little girl, we're helpless against them. But how much is all of their power against infinite power and infinite authority? You notice that Mark doesn't give us any details about this exorcism at all. None. In fact, he doesn't give us one word about how it happens. When he does mention the exorcism, he mentions it in the past tense. It's already happened when he speaks of it. So you can tell that what matters for the story that Mark is telling here isn't the exorcism, it's the dialogue between these two characters, between the man from Galilee, this first character, this man who is more than a man, who has this power. Well, let's look at the second character, this Syrophoenician woman. Now, Mark's given you plenty of detail here to make sure that it is clear in your mind this woman is not a Jew. He says the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. The woman was a Gentile. That's literally a Greek. The implication, of course, is a non-Jew, a Gentile person. And he tells us more than that. He tells us about her people. Besides the general statement that she's a Gentile, he tells us she was by birth, or literally a descendant of, and then he uses the word Syrophoenician. It's a very specific word. This is the only place in the Bible that it's used. He's telling us of the Phoenician people, and specifically she's from those descendants of the Phoenician people who are from the region of Syria. That's why she's the Syrophoenician woman. She's from the region of Syria, which is near the Holy Land, and that's, of course, to be distinguished from the Phoenician peoples who settled in North Africa. She's not from that group of the Phoenicians. She's a Syrophoenician. And if you know your Old Testament, when he says Syrophoenicia and he mentions the cities of Tyre and Sidon, you've heard of Tyre before. You know these people. They were mentioned clear back in the book of Joshua. Around 1200 BC, as Joshua cleared out the land, the city of Tyre gets a mention there. And you remember later, David makes an arrangement with these same people, with their king Hiram of Tyre, and he makes the arrangement for building supplies in 1 Kings. And you remember Solomon renews and expands that relationship and enlisted Hiram's help in the building and construction of the temple that Solomon built for the Lord in Jerusalem. But it wasn't always a positive relationship, because you remember another descendant from this area married to the king Ahab. Do you remember? Ahab married the daughter of the king of the Sidonians, and her name, of course, was Jezebel. And that's an important character because that marriage led to the introduction of idolatry into Israel. And the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Joel and Amos and Zechariah, all of them warned of the upcoming destruction of Sidon and its satellite towns. And so this woman is a descendant of those people. So she's got at least 3 strikes against her, right? She's a woman, which automatically at this point in history makes her inferior to a man. She's a Gentile, and she's not just any Gentile. She's from the idolatrous people of the Syrophoenicians. So as one commentator put it, even Levi the tax collector must have raised his eyebrows at this woman who has the pluck to beg Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. Yet, that's exactly what she does. And look at how Mark presents us with her problem. He doesn't give us any detail about the girl. It just says her little daughter. And you've seen that language before from Mark. Little daughter could refer to any girl up to marriageable age. But since verse 30 calls her a child, uses the word for a young child, I'm presuming that this is a young girl. This is a little girl. And this poor little girl, Mark says, had an unclean spirit. And as I mentioned, Matthew records further that she was severely oppressed by this demon. I don't know about you, but when I read of this little girl who is severely oppressed by this unclean spirit, I have 2 thoughts immediately. And the first one is, how did this little girl come to have an unclean spirit, to be demonized? Because I have some idea of how that usually happens. Maybe we'll talk more about that in the January Bible study, but how in the world did it happen to this little girl? This is a very dark situation. And of course, the second thought is, can you imagine the distress of her poor mother? You imagine being the mom in this situation, because this woman is not drugged out and just passively letting her daughter be abused. She's a mom. And she is engaged, and she is trying for help, and she is desperate. And here she sees a solution come to town. And so she came, and Mark records, fell down at Jesus' feet. Now that is the right posture for an unworthy sinner who wants something from the Lord. It's the right position. She's face down at his feet. She's showing by the very position of her body who's the superior in this situation and who's the inferior. And frankly, I think the 12 should have spent a lot more time in this position where we find her. And so these initial indications are good, aren't they? I mean, this woman has a desperate need. She recognizes her need. She fully recognizes her own helplessness in this situation, and she knows Jesus to be the one who can help her, and so she seeks him out, and she prostrates herself before him, falling at his feet and humbly requesting his favor. This is a good setup, especially in Mark's gospel. We've been led to believe nothing but good things are going to come from Jesus from this kind of setup, but there's just this one problem. She's a Gentile. She's a woman of Syrophoenician descent, and Jesus didn't come for Gentiles. You remember, we saw Mark record the account of Jesus sending out the 12 on their first mission. He left out a detail that Matthew spelled out for us. In Matthew chapter 10, these 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In fact, Matthew records that Jesus told this woman effectively the same thing. In Matthew's account of this, he answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That was his purpose. That shouldn't surprise you. As the Apostle Paul put it to the church in Rome. For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs. Not to everybody on earth, given to the patriarchs. And so Christ became a servant to the circumcised, not to the uncircumcised, to the children of Israel, to the Jews. And this woman, therefore, is not his target. She comes, and he has no bread for her. He has bread to give to his people. He has come to feed God's children, the nation of Israel. And so he tells her in verse 27, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, he didn't say, in saying that the dogs will never get fed, right? He said, let the children first eat. It's literally eat all they want, be filled. Let that happen first. So he makes it clear, Gentiles are not the priority right now. And you are a Gentile. Look in the face of this at her persistence. And ask yourself, put yourself in her situation and ask yourselves, how would I respond to that statement? Call me a dog. Would you be offended? Or would you immediately hear that and abandon hope and shriek in desperation, oh no, he's not going to help my baby? Would you hate the Jews and all their smug superiority? Well, instead of any of that, you get what is, I think, just about the greatest display of humble and patient faith we see anywhere in the Gospels, and certainly we've seen so far in Mark's Gospel in verse 28. But she answered him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You hear what she's doing there? First, she acknowledges his lordship. She uses the title, kurios, Lord, Master, the word for ownership. And then she does what you haven't seen anybody in Mark's Gospel do yet. She understands a parable of Jesus. Do you see that? She enters into the parable. She understands it. She recognizes the truth of it. She sees her place in it, and then she extends it. She owns her station. She doesn't dispute that. She is, in Jesus' words, a dog. She uses the same language. She doesn't dispute the priority of Jew before Gentile. She doesn't argue that. She says effectively, Master, you're right. You shouldn't take the children's food and throw it to us dogs. Master, it's true. Your priority should be to the Jews. But this little dog is just under the table, taking what falls to the floor. What the children don't need, the excess. This is humble on her part, and it is shrewd. She says effectively, your provision for your children is so bountiful that there's plenty left over for a Gentile dog like me to have a crumb. It's like this woman learned the lesson of the loaves and the fishes without ever even being there. She got the message, right? With the Lord, there's always plenty left over. I don't need to take their meal away from them. I just want one of the crumbs that fall to the floor, some of the excess, some of the plenty that I know you have. She is the first person in Mark's gospel to really hear the word of Jesus that he speaks to her. And I take it that Jesus knew exactly how she was going to respond. He knew this. You know that he came here in order to teach his disciples. Well, look, he's just given them an incredible object lesson on what true faith looks like with this woman, and setting up the obstacle of the parable like he does. As the Lexham Bible Dictionary puts it, The Syrophoenician Canaanite woman therefore stands as an exception to the normal order of salvation history, and she is put forward as a model of faith and discipleship. She is being put forward as a model. You can tell Jesus makes his approval of her response crystal clear, doesn't he? Verse 29, he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. And so this Gentile woman gets a crumb from the master's table. And you may think at this point in history, well, of course Jesus ministered to Gentiles. Of course he extended his ministry in this way. I mean, I'm a Gentile and Jesus saved me. But don't let your experience at this point in history cloud your eyes to what a bombshell this was at the time. As commentator James Edwards put it, in journeying to the vicinity of Tyre, and particularly in receiving a Syrophoenician woman, Jesus expands the scope of his ministry beyond anything conceivable of the Messiah. That is, of the Jewish Messiah. He goes on, from a socio-religious perspective, Jesus' visit to Tyre universalizes the concept of Messiah in terms of geography, ethnicity, gender, and religion in a way entirely unprecedented in Judaism. You saw the first hint of this to come. You remember when Jesus healed the man with the legion of demons and told him to go back to the Gentile cities, to the Decapolis, and tell those people what God had done for him. And you see the second massive indication in this amazing story of the Gentile woman in the region of Tyre and Sidon in Syria, this Syrophoenician woman. And you know our namesake as a church, Antioch. Antioch was a city in, do you remember where? In northern Syria. The Gentiles there were the first to be called Christians, little Christs. And so then, down to today, us Gentiles continue to eat the crumbs that fall. Our hope is not that God has given up on the children and thrown his food to the dogs instead of feeding his children, Israel. That's not our hope. Our hope is that the last dog will one day soon be fed with these crumbs, and then God will turn back to his children. And as Paul told the Roman church, so all Israel will be saved. Father, that is our prayer. We come as, like this woman, humble Gentiles, knowing that the promises to the patriarchs, great and sweeping and amazing as they weren't given to us. We were those outside the blessings of Israel. We were not promised a Messiah. And yet, Lord, even you said, even back to Abraham, that in him all the nations would be blessed. And so in this Syrophoenician woman, we begin to see the truth of that statement. And so in our own lives, we recognize we had no claim on your mercy as Gentiles, and yet we eat the crumbs. And we do so humbly and with hearts full of gratitude, and in the expectation that eventually you will turn your attention back to your set-apart people, Israel. In the meantime, we are grateful in Jesus' name for his work. Amen. This is a remarkably encouraging story, this Syrophoenician woman receiving such mercy at the hand of Jesus when he wasn't sent to minister to her. That story can be your story. He's still throwing crumbs to Gentile dogs. Don't leave here today without receiving from his hand.
Let's all stand as we sing.